Thomas Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, is increasingly remembered today as one of the most controversial figures in American history. Many modern commentators and publications label him as the worst great president, a corrupt president, or simply the worst president in American history. But why has Wilson's legacy become so tainted and unforgiving? Is this harsh judgment a genuine reflection of his own historical failure, or instead has a modern wave of selective outrage worked to strip Wilson of his rightful place in history among America's greatest presidents? Let's find out. In 1910, Woodrow Wilson had run for governor of New Jersey on a reform platform, presenting himself as a full-fledged progressive, independent of Democratic Party bosses. The party bosses had believed that Wilson would be easy to control, as former President Teddy Roosevelt believed as well. Wilson, however, campaigned on a promise to be an unconstitutional governor, breaking with the established Democrats. As governor, Wilson signed a direct primary law undermining boss control, a corrupt practices campaign finance law, and introduced New Jersey's first Workers' Compensation Act. Within months, Wilson had earned national and bipartisan recognition as a reformer and a leader of the progressive movement. During Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign, even Teddy Roosevelt, who loathed Wilson, demonstrated a still nuanced view of his opponent, and though he would never give such a nuanced take on the man publicly, in private he would note, "Wilson is a good man, who has in no way shown that he possesses any special fitness for the presidency. Until he was 50 years old as college professor and college president, he advocated with skill, intelligence, and good breeding the outworn doctrines which were responsible for 4/5 of the political troubles of the United States. He is an able man, and I have no doubt could speedily acquaint himself with these problems, and would not show Taft's muddle-headed inability to try to understand them when left by himself." Though the primary differences between the New Nationalism platform of Teddy Roosevelt and the New Freedom platform of Woodrow Wilson were primarily to be found in their positions on the extent of tariffs and antitrust laws, as the campaigns went on, the two candidates' platforms became more and more alike. Woodrow Wilson won the 1912 elections in a landslide victory, winning a record 435 of the 531 available electoral votes. He carried 40 states, the most ever for a Democrat up to that point, and more than any candidate in nearly half a century, flipping 21 states that had voted Republican in 1908, including industrial powerhouses like New York, Illinois, and Ohio. He became the first Democrat since 1892 to win the presidency, and his election saw the first time that Massachusetts, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, West Virginia, and Wisconsin went blue. Democrats would not carry many of these states again until the New Deal era. Despite the split of the national votes between four men, Wilson, Roosevelt, Taft, and Debs, Wilson still managed to secure 41.8% of the vote while flipping 22 states from their prior positions in the 1908 elections. Once Woodrow Wilson took office, his New Freedom platform immediately took aim to break up monopolies, lower tariffs, and help ordinary working Americans. His first Congress delivered an unprecedented reform package, first among them being the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of 1913, which slashed tariff rates to the lowest level since the American Civil War, and created a modern income tax to make up for the revenue which Wilson used to shift the tax burden onto the wealthy. This ended high protection policies that had enriched big trusts and crushed consumers, bringing Wilson into direct conflict with their interests. That same year, tackling America's unstable monetary system, Wilson passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which established the Federal Reserve System of 12 regional banks to stabilize the currency and credit. In making the Fed Act, Wilson personally negotiated with Congress, meeting the Democratic banking chairman E.C. Glass and progressive advisor Louis Brandeis to design a plan with strong government oversight, explicitly leaving private bankers off of the Federal Reserve Board. Only after the insistence of Wilson did the progressive version of the Fed bill pass, which he proudly signed into law. For the first time, the federal government gained broad authority to adjust interest rates and money supply, creating a safety valve for financial crises. This year also saw the establishment of the Department of Labor on March 4th of 1913, with the appointment of former Union official and coal miner William B. Wilson as the department's first secretary. Wilson, seeking to help rural and working-class Americans, appointed a Rural Credits Commission to study farm credit early in his presidency as well. This led to the 1916 Federal Farm Loan Act that I will cover later, which created a system of federal land banks to make affordable long-term loans to farmers, aiming to rectify the scarcity of reliable credit at reasonable interest rates for farmers. The year of 1913 also saw Woodrow Wilson suffer a stroke affecting his left arm and likely both hemispheres of his brain. Wilson nonetheless denied the seriousness of this event, despite a report from neurologist Dr. Silas Mitchell declaring that Woodrow Wilson would not survive his first term due to the fact that such a stroke was indeed foreshadowing far more serious strokes to come. Surprisingly, one may find this was not Wilson's first stroke. In 1896, Woodrow Wilson, as an instructor at Princeton University, had suffered loss of dexterity in his right hand and transitory pains in his right arm. This required writing with his left hand for several months. According to his brother in law, following the stroke, Wilson became far more intense, serious, and obsessed with work. As president of Princeton University in 1904, Woodrow Wilson had briefly lost his ability to use his right hand, while in 1906 he experienced a near complete loss of vision in his left eye. Despite medical professionals recommending that Wilson adopt a more sedentary lifestyle following those events, Wilson had refused, choosing instead to press onward in his political pursuits. In 1914, the Federal Trade Commission Act occurred, creating a new FTC, or Federal Trade Commission, to investigate and publicize unfair business practices. This year, Wilson also passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which at least attempted to strengthen trust busting by outlawing anti competitive practices such as price fixing, interlocking directorates, etc. It explicitly exempted labor and farm organizations from prosecution, earning Wilson the support of both sectors. Wilson signed off on the Smith-Lever Act, creating the first ever national cooperative extension service, partnering land-grant universities and the USDA to send agricultural and home economics experts into every county in America, teaching modern farming and homemaking techniques to rural Americans. Wilson, in other words, had brought the college to the farmer. When World War I began, in 1914, Wilson initially pursued neutrality, hoping the United States could act as a neutral mediator in the conflict. Colonel Teddy Roosevelt vehemently disagreed, and even more so following the sinking of the ships Lusitania, Arabic, Falaba, Housatonic, Heldston, Aztec, and Sussex ships, all destroyed by the Central Powers of World War I, more specifically Germany. Despite his neutrality in the Great War, in April of 1914, President Woodrow Wilson's patience with the tyrannical dictatorship of General Victoriano Huerta in Mexico snapped. The previous year, General Huerta had overthrown and murdered the democratically elected president Francisco Madero, seizing Mexico City and proclaiming himself as president. Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's regime as anything other than a government of butchers, cutting off all arms shipments from the dictator and declaring that the United States would only stand alongside constitutional rulers. In early April, Huerta's forces in Tampico briefly detained a squadron of U.S. sailors. Seizing on the incident and determined to prevent a shipment of German rifles from reaching Huerta, Wilson ordered naval squadrons under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher to depart for Mexico's Veracruz. On April 21st, Fletcher's ships began bombarding Veracruz's port defenses. By the next day, U.S. Marines and sailors had stormed ashore, overcoming token resistance around the Naval Academy and seizing the city's docks and customs house. The 6-month occupation strangled Huerta, who was cut off from both European munitions and American support. Huerta resigned in July of 1914, going into exile, with Wilson promptly extending recognition to the constitutionalist government of Venustiano Carranza. Wilson had risked war to uphold this principle that legitimate governments must rest on the consent of the governed. In 1915, he approved the Lafayette-Siemens Act, a novel law improving safety, wages, and conditions for American sailors. When Wilson had been lobbied personally by an elderly seaman who had been neglected by America's maritime laws, Wilson signed the bill saying it was the only chance to get something like justice done for a class of workmen who have been too much neglected. Despite the prevalence of American nativism at the time, Wilson also vetoed 2 restrictive migration bills during his presidency, asserting that some of the best stuff of America has come out of foreign lands. In July of 1915, Haiti descended into chaos. Its president had been lynched by an enraged mob on July 28th. American bankers feared the default of Haiti's debts, while American naval officers began pacing over Germany's growing commercial foothold in the country. Wilson demanded a return to order and legitimate government. That night, President Wilson, citing his duty to preserve the Monroe Doctrine, ordered 330 U.S. Marines ashore in Port-au-Prince. Under the cover of darkness on July 28th, they seized the National Palace, disarmed rival militias, and restored calm at the capital with barely a shot fired. By August 10th, American forces had secured the towns of Cap Haitien and Jacmel, with Haiti's fractured leadership inviting an American-supervised provisional government to fill the power vacuum. Later, in December of 1915, Wilson signed the Haitian-American Treaty, creating a U.S.-led gendarmerie, placing customs revenues under American control, and empowering the U.S. to oversee Haiti's finances. Over the next 4 years, American Marines patrolled mountain valleys to root out Haiti's rebels, building roads and schools to modernize the country, even training a Haitian police force under American officers, saving Haiti from armed anarchy while protecting America from German imperial plans. No great figure is free of controversy, and Woodrow Wilson is no different. As is usually known, Wilson's record on race has been a hot topic. However, many have distorted this unfortunate historical fact and twisted it to peddle a narrative implying that Woodrow Wilson personally segregated the federal government. This is an abject lie. A farce. In fact, Woodrow Wilson refused to follow the recommendations of Postmaster General Albert Burleson, who suggested a formal, sweeping segregation edict for federal executive employees. Instead, Wilson simply allowed Burleson and other executive branch officials to carry out their own plans on their own authority. Was this the right thing to do? Of course not. However, the characterization of Woodrow Wilson as the president who segregated the White House is simply a propagandistic falsehood. Another lie about Woodrow Wilson is that he was a fan of the pro-Klan film Birth of a Nation, which the president played within the White House. When protesters confronted him over the showing of Birth of a Nation at the White House, Wilson strongly denied any intent to endorse the film. His private secretary produced a letter from him stating that he had been, in his own words, entirely unaware of the character of the movie before it was presented and has at no time expressed his approbation of it. Its exhibition at the White House was a courtesy extended to an old acquaintance. In other words, Wilson insisted that the screening was a personal favor to director Griffith, who Wilson had known, not an official statement. According to the director's own account, Wilson merely said, "I am pleased to do this little thing for you because a long time ago you took a day out of your busy life to do something for me." This statement by no means necessitates ideological support, an interpretation which is backed by the fact that Wilson, through his prior statements, had attempted to distance himself from the pro-Klan film's messaging. Wilson is frequently quoted as having said that Birth of a Nation is, quote, like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is also terribly true, unquote. This quote was invented by Milton McKay's 1937 publication in Scribner's Magazine. In the original quote provided by the director of the movie, Griffith, Wilson is said to have stated that the film teaches history by lightning and nothing more. Griffith never attested to the notion that Wilson stated the film was true, nor does Wilson refer to the film as writing history. In 1921, before his death, Wilson would state, "I have always felt that this was a very unfortunate production, and I wish most sincerely that its production might be avoided, particularly in communities where there are so many colored people." It is perhaps an even more infamous lie that Birth of a Nation was the first movie played at the White House. This is a lie which has been peddled by countless historians throughout the last century. Some of them more honestly misguided than others, but they're wrong all the same. Although Birth of a Nation was the first movie shown inside of the White House, the Italian film Cabiria, screenwritten by Italian fascist Gabriele D'Annunzio, was in fact the first film shown at the White House. It was shown on the White House lawn before President Wilson and his entire family half of a year before the screening of Birth of a Nation ever took place. Wilson is said to have deeply enjoyed the film in contrast to his lukewarm reception of Birth of a Nation. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson nominated the Jewish progressive attorney Louis D. Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Brandeis was the first Jewish justice in American history, known for defending workers and limiting corporate power. 1916 also saw Wilson sign off the first ever Workers' Compensation Act for federal employees, as he also advocated for a national ban on most child labor, though the Supreme Court would strike that proposal down. Wilson granted the Philippines greater autonomy through the 1916 Jones Act, promising independence to be instituted within 30 years. In July of 1916, he signed the Federal Aid Road Act, inaugurating federal aid for state highway construction. To avert a crippling railroad strike, the president urged Congress to pass the Adamson Act in September of 1916, which for the first time established an 8-hour workday for all interstate rail employees, the first federal law setting an 8-hour day in the history of America's private industry. Wilson, previously a supporter of the 17th Amendment in 1913, quickly became associated with the suffrage movement in 1916 when banners across the New York City suffrage parade read in bold letters, "President Wilson favors votes for women." On August 25th of 1916, Wilson signed the Organic Act, establishing the National Park Service as a new federal bureau in the Interior Department, fulfilling what Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson's rival, had started years prior. On top of this, Wilson proclaimed new monuments, the Acadia National Park, the Bandelier National Monument, etc. Wilson backed the previously mentioned Federal Farm Loan Act, which established 12 federal land banks and countless local farm loan associations, creating a federally chartered credit system so that farmers could obtain long-term, low-interest loans against their land. The act increased credit to rural family farmers by providing mortgages and market-backed bonds, which enabled small farm owners to stay on the land, guaranteeing that the credit needs of farmers would be met, thereby stabilizing rural America. This support, which Wilson provided for cooperative credit, was part of his broader agenda to undercut financial monopolies and empower the average American. Wilson also signed off on the Warehouse Act, which stabilized commodity markets and credit and reduced the boom-bust cycle in farm prices. At the 1916 Democratic Convention in St. Louis, Wilson, winning the ballot, called for military preparedness, a World Association of Nations to maintain peace after the World War, Pan-Americanism, a ban on child labor, the right to vote for women, and a reform of America's prison system. Wilson, during his 1916 presidential campaign, captured the support of America's labor unions, the few women across American states who enjoyed suffrage, most ethnicities who hated the Brits and resented Roosevelt, as well as the majority of progressives and even many American socialists. Wilson barely won his re-election in November of 1916 by razor-thin margins. Over 61% of eligible voters turned out, flooding the polls with a level of civic engagement unseen in years. On election day, no candidate was assured of victory. New York papers and foreign governments prematurely declared Wilson's Republican opponent, Charles Evans Hughes, as the winner. Rumor has it that even Hughes himself went to bed convinced that he had captured the presidency, only to be roused the next morning with the unfortunate news that Wilson had mounted a dramatic comeback. By Wednesday evening, Wilson had inched ahead in the Electoral College, picking up votes especially in western and mountain states. All eyes turned to California's 13 electors, and when Democrats declared the state for the incumbent, on Thursday afternoon, the Republican Party conceded, sealing Wilson's second term with 277 electoral votes to Hughes' 254. In doing so, Wilson became the first Democrat since Andrew Jackson in 1832 to win 2 consecutive terms. His nearly 9.25 million popular votes shattered his own 1912 total by almost 3 million votes, surging in every region, especially where women's suffrage had newly expanded the electorate. He flipped California and Washington back into Democratic hands for the first time since the Southern Reconstruction, and while he ran behind in parts of New England and the Midwest, he secured overwhelming leads across the South and the Mountain West. Wilson secured 49.2% of the popular vote, with Hughes winning 46.1%. On April 6th of 1917, the USA entered World War I on the side of the Allies, fighting to make the world safe for democracy by Wilson's account. Nearly 4 million American men were conscripted through a selective draft which occurred as a middle ground between the preferred voluntarism of the American people and the planned universal military training proposed by war college planners. Women were admitted to the Red Cross service, and Wilson personally donated the wool from the White House laundry heap to the Red Cross for war bonds. Following entry into World War I, Wilson founded the War Industries Board, headed by the financier Bernard Baruch, which coordinated industrial production for war material, standardizing factories, and setting production priorities. Under Baruch's persuasion, American factories increased output dramatically as production rose over 20%. The representative of the Army on the War Industries Board was Brigadier General Hugh S. Johnson, who would later be important in the New Deal brain trust of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. According to John Kennedy Ohl, author of Hugh S. Johnson and the New Deal, Johnson and Baruch first worked together in the interwar period in the planning for economic mobilization for future wars. The WIB, or War Industries Board alumni, believed that the World War I mobilization showed that the military was incapable of handling the manifold problems of mobilizing a modern industrialized nation for war. Baruch, in particular, believed that it was too riddled with personal jealousies and selfish interests to procure its own supplies effectively, and also that it simply did not appreciate the destabilizing impact of military orders on the civilian economy. The U.S. Food Administration, overseen by Herbert Hoover, encouraged voluntary food conservation such as meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, home war gardens, and persuaded farmers to surge production. In 1917, Wilson created a Women in Industry Service section within the Department of Labor, appointing a woman, Mary Van Cleek, to head it. She was the first woman to hold such federal authority under a wartime agency. Woodrow Wilson, under the 1917 Jones-Shafroth Act, even extended U.S. citizenship and self-government to the people of Puerto Rico. When U.S. railroads suffered catastrophic breakdowns under war pressure in 1917, Woodrow Wilson effectively nationalized them. By 1918, Wilson had founded the National War Labor Board, convening labor and management together to arbitrate disputes. The board, appointed and co-chaired by Wilson, endorsed equal pay for women, the 8-hour workday, and collective bargaining rights. Both William Howard Taft and former labor lawyer F.P. Walsh were present on the board and influenced its outcomes. Unions agreed not to strike during the wartime emergency, and in return, many workers gained higher wages and shorter working hours. Union membership surged from 2.7 million members to over 4 million by 1919. Woodrow Wilson's interventionist economics didn't emerge in a vacuum. They grew from his Southern upbringing in Virginia and his intellectual debt to the Southern Confederacy's own experience of total war economic controls. People forget, Woodrow Wilson was born in 1856 and lived as a child through the American Civil War. In 1865, as the Civil War had come to a close, the young Woodrow Wilson had seen Confederate President Jefferson Davis pass through his town of Augusta after his capture by Union troops at Irwinton, Georgia. Wilson's father, Reverend Dr. Wilson, took him to personally see former Confederate General Robert E. Lee on his final Southern tour, which was a very striking moment for the young 13-year-old Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's father, who was a founder of the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States, had ensured that the young Woodrow absorbed the Confederacy's views on government and society from an early age. Well, let's look at what they actually did. During the Civil War, the Confederate government had nationalized farm produce, livestock, cotton, and munitions, seizing them at below market rates from the private sector. By mid 1863, the Confederacy had nationalized railroads, telegraphs, and shipping. State ordnance bureaus built powder mills, cannon foundries, armories, and textile works from scratch, and price controls plus in kind taxation made the Confederacy itself cotton's largest merchant. The Confederate public bureaucracy mushroomed to some 70,000 employees in the 4 years of the war. Wilson's wartime agencies were directly inspired by Confederate policy. The War Industries Board, the Railroad Administration, the Food and Fuel Administrations, all directly influenced by the Confederate government's impressment of food and cotton, its nationwide price controls, its commandeering of railroads and factories, etc. Both the Confederate States and Wilson's administration dictated prices and profits, centralized transport assets, and in both cases, free market mechanisms were suspended permanently or temporarily, with the government stepping in as a planner, allocator, and purchaser. Through this, we see that Wilson's policies curated a state apparatus profoundly influenced by precedents seen in the Confederate States of America in mobilizing and controlling national economic life. Once America entered the war, in April of 1917, Colonel Teddy Roosevelt sought to mend fences, urging Woodrow Wilson to allow him to remake his Rough Riders to go fight in the war. He had implored Wilson at the White House, stating, "What I have said and thought, and what others have said and thought, is all dust in a windy street if now we can make your message good." The White House staffer, Thomas Brahami, wrote, "The president doesn't like Theodore Roosevelt, and he was not one bit effusive in his greeting." Soon after that initial jot, later on in the course of the meeting, he added on that the president had thawed out and was laughing and talking back. They had a real good visit. Roosevelt stated after the visit, "I told Wilson that I would go die on the field of battle, that I would never return if only he would let me go." The White House denied Roosevelt's request 3 days later, with Wilson stating, somewhat vindictively one must admit, "I really think the best way to treat Mr. Roosevelt is to take no notice of him. That breaks his heart and is the best punishment that can be administered. After all, while what he says is outrageous in every particular, he does, I am afraid, keep within the law, for he is as careful as he is unscrupulous." Wilson genuinely believed that Teddy Roosevelt was merely looking for a publicity stunt and hoped to use the Army's best officers to compensate for his own shortcomings, as Arthur Walworth points out in his biography of Wilson. Following his signing of the Selective Service Act, Wilson stated, "It would be very agreeable for me to pay Mr. Roosevelt this compliment, and the Allies the compliment, of sending to their aid one of our most distinguished public men. But this is not the time for any action not calculated to contribute to the immediate success of the war. The business now at hand is undramatic, practical, and of scientific definiteness and precision." The American economy performed miraculously during 1917 and 1918. Production of munitions, food, raw materials all soared, and full employment was achieved. After the war, all those special wartime boards would be disbanded, with government spending nearly returned to pre-war levels. In 1918, Wilson approved of the Smith-Sears Veterans Rehabilitation Act, which expanded services to help wounded soldiers learn the trades. July 3rd, 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act had been signed, which prohibited killing, selling, or transporting protected migratory birds and their eggs without a permit. As the World War drew to a close, Wilson laid out his peace vision. In January of 1918, he presented his famous 14 points, which promised a just peace through open diplomacy, free trade, and national self-determination, as well as disarmament. Notably, Wilson demanded that all colonial peoples be treated fairly and all secret treaties would be voided. Point 14 of his 14 points called for a general association of nations to guarantee mutual political independence and security. In other words, an explicit call for an international League of Nations, a general association of nations offering mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small nations alike. Wilson was convinced that this league would remake international life for the better. He wrote that the league would transform international relations and usher in a new era of world peace. His speech explicitly called for self-rule for colonized peoples and reconciliation with former enemies. Armed with his 14 points, President Wilson personally led the American delegation to the Paris Peace Conference in late 1918, making him the first sitting American president ever to travel to Europe. There, he tirelessly pushed for enshrining the League of Nations in the peace treaty. Although Allied leaders compromised on many terms, Wilson held firm on the League provision. Ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles included Article 231 to 287, creating the League of Nations. Wilson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for his role as founder of the League of Nations. In this way, Wilson is correctly to be remembered as a forerunner of progressive internationalism. Wilson, however, proved unable or unwilling to accommodate American Senate concerns about U.S. sovereignty under the League. Despite growing Republican opposition, he refused to entertain any reservations or amendments, issuing his directives through First Lady Edith Wilson, who by that point was virtually his sole intermediary in the fight over ratification. We'll get to why that was in a moment. When Senate Republicans proposed limiting the president's power to commit American forces to league actions without express congressional approval, Wilson denounced the revisions as a betrayal of his vision and instructed his Democratic allies to vote down the amended treaty. And in an unexpected alliance with the so-called irreconcilables, they succeeded in defeating U.S. membership in the League of Nations. The Senate's rejection effectively doomed America's participation in the very institution that Wilson had championed as the cornerstone of a new global order. In September of 1918, as racial tensions ran high, the president issued a presidential proclamation completely denouncing lynching and mob violence against black citizens, calling such acts a disgrace and horror. As Encyclopedia Britannica states, President Woodrow Wilson castigated the white race as the aggressor in both the Chicago and Washington riots, and efforts were launched to promote racial harmony through voluntary organizations and ameliorative legislation in Congress. Or, in his own words, I say plainly that every American who takes part in the action of a mob or gives it any sort of countenance is no true son of this great democracy, but its betrayer. Wilson did not author any segregation laws by executive order and gave some limited public counsel regarding racial justice. Wilson's legacy regarding race was regrettably imperfect, and it must be said that through his deference to state governments on problems which arose regarding racial violence, that he did nothing meaningful to quell the flames of the race riots in summer of 1919. His intent was always to stabilize race relations rather than inflame them or pit whites against blacks, which was his reasoning for why he increasingly, throughout his life, believed in segregation as a means to reduce friction between different ethnic and racial groups. Today, we can thankfully denounce that view with confidence, though in Wilson's era, it was simply the norm. By 1918, Wilson had endorsed the 19th Amendment, publicly becoming a strong supporter of giving women the vote. He urged Congress towards suffrage, stating, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" Congress would pass the amendment in 1919, and by 1920 it was ratified, an event which he personally celebrated. On that occasion, he declared that women winning the vote in his administration was, quote, "one of the greatest honors of my life." Altogether, banks were regulated, trusts were checked, labor enjoyed new protections, and taxes were made more progressive. In October of 1919, following his abrupt return from a speaking tour, Woodrow Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke, his worst to date, leaving Wilson in a paralytic state. This required his wife, Edith Wilson, to begin screening papers and callers for him. Though she became an important secretary for the president, as she would later write during the 1930s, she never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs, only choosing when to present matters to her husband and which were important enough to disclose to him. At this point, frank public discussion of serious illness in a sitting president was almost unheard of. Physicians and family alike believed that any hint of debility would be interpreted as moral weakness or cowardice, undermining both the president's authority and the country's confidence in its own leadership. Despite Wilson's paralysis, Dr. Cary Grayson, Wilson's personal physician, insisted repeatedly to cabinet members that Wilson's mind was not only clear, but very active, and discouraged disclosure of his physical condition. The prevailing medical culture prioritized keeping a patient's vulnerabilities hidden, especially for someone in such a high-stakes office. Joseph L. Tumulty, Woodrow Wilson's private secretary, continued to draft statements, handle correspondence, and relay only the most critical matters to Wilson, deeming his judgment sound even under his paralytic condition. In 1920, Wilson established the Women's Bureau within the Department of Labor, appointing Mary Anderson as its first director. Mary Anderson's bureau set standards for female employment and expanded job opportunities for women in government service. Before he left office, Wilson signed off on the National Civilian Rehabilitation Act, which created a federal state vocational rehabilitation program for disabled Americans, funding training, guidance, and job placement for those whose disabilities would otherwise preclude them from joining the job market. By the standards of his day, while it's true that Wilson was not necessarily a progressive president when it came to the racial issues of his day, he certainly was not exceptional for the era, and if anything can most definitely be classed as a moderate. Under Wilson, the U.S. for the first time had an income tax, a central bank, an FTC, and rising labor laws. On the world stage, he gave the U.S. a permanent international presence, even if his League of Nations itself ultimately failed. As the Nobel Committee put it in 1920, the President of the United States has succeeded in bringing a design for a fundamental law of humanity into present-day international politics. Domestically, he championed ordinary citizens by lowering tariffs, controlling big business, strengthening labor rights, and breaking new ground in the democratic franchise by supporting women's rights. Economically, his war programs yielded a robust post-war recovery, and internationally, he alone among world leaders crafted a truly forward-looking peace plan, the 14 points, and he gambled everything on making it work. We can and should criticize Wilson's shortcomings, but history shows that Wilson was, for his time, a highly progressive leader dedicated to expanding liberty and justice at home while promoting peace and popular rule abroad.